The Supermarine S.6B was conceived during one of the most intense chapters in the history of competitive aviation, the Schneider Trophy races. Established in 1913, the competition was designed to encourage technological advancement in seaplane design, with nations competing for prestige through speed records and engineering breakthroughs. By the late 1920s, the contest had become not only a sporting event but also a matter of national pride, with Britain, Italy, and the United States vying for dominance. The British Air Ministry recognized the value of the competition as a testing ground for aerodynamics and high-performance engines. Success in the Schneider races brought international acclaim and provided data critical for the development of future military aircraft. Supermarine, a relatively small company at the time, had already built a reputation with its earlier seaplane racers, the S4 and S5, both designed by Reginald Joseph Mitchell. Mitchell, later to be known as the creator of the Spitfire, was already demonstrating his talent for combining sleek aerodynamic forms with powerful engines. The S6 appeared in 1929 as a natural progression from the S5, equipped with the new Rolls-Royce R engine, an advanced liquid-cooled V12 capable of producing well over 800 horsepower. Its design emphasized minimal drag, with a long, slender fuselage, thin wings supported by streamlined struts, and radiators integrated into the floats for efficient cooling. The S6 won the 1929 Schneider Trophy, proving the superiority of British engineering, but the rules of the competition required further victories for permanent retention of the trophy. By 1931, Britain was facing the final contest. Financial and political difficulties nearly prevented participation, as government funding was scarce and public enthusiasm had waned in the wake of the Great Depression. However, private fundraising, most notably from Lady Lucy Houston, secured the resources necessary for Supermarine to continue. Mitchell and his team refined the S6 into the S6B, strengthening the structure, enlarging the floats, and increasing engine output to nearly 2,300 horsepower. These changes pushed the aircraft to the edge of existing materials and technology, but they were necessary to secure victory. The result was an aircraft that represented the pinnacle of interwar racing seaplane design. The S6B was a blend of aerodynamic efficiency and raw power, designed to operate for short bursts at extreme speeds. Unlike earlier seaplanes, it embodied a philosophy that would later influence fighter aircraft: tight streamlining, integrated cooling, and high-performance power plants working in harmony with aerodynamic design. The origins of the S6B, rooted in competition and necessity, set the stage for its transformation from a racing machine into the foundation for one of the most iconic combat aircraft of the Second World War. The story of the S6B begins, then, not as a military requirement, but as a product of rivalry, innovation, and national pride. Yet the lessons learned from its creation would resonate far beyond the waters of the Solent or the prestige of the Schneider Trophy. They would provide the design principles and engineering confidence that helped Britain prepare for the far more serious challenge of aerial combat in the skies over Europe. The prototype and testing phase of the Supermarine S6B was marked by an extraordinary effort to refine every aspect of the design for maximum speed and reliability. The aircraft was essentially an evolution of the earlier S6, but the changes were far from cosmetic. Mitchell and his team at Supermarine worked in close collaboration with Rolls-Royce to adapt the R engine to new levels of performance. Capable of producing around 2,300 horsepower, the R engine required advanced cooling solutions, as overheating during sustained runs had been a problem in previous races. Engineers integrated surface radiators directly into the floats and wings, reducing drag while ensuring adequate heat dissipation. This feature, both elegant and functional, became one of the defining innovations of the design. The first prototype of the S6B was completed in the summer of 1931 and moved to Calshot, the RAF's seaplane base on the Solent, for trials. Test flights immediately demonstrated both the potential and the hazards of the machine. The aircraft was extraordinarily fast, accelerating rapidly to speeds that pushed the boundaries of available instrumentation. Pilots reported that while the aircraft handled smoothly at racing speeds, the immense power of the R engine required constant vigilance during takeoff and landing. Floatplanes of the era often struggled with water handling, and the S6B was no exception. But once airborne, it revealed a level of aerodynamic refinement unmatched by its rivals. Engineers used the test phase to perfect fine details, from propeller pitch to fuel flow under extreme loads. The Rolls-Royce team, led by Ernest Hives, worked tirelessly to ensure that the engine could sustain the stress of the high-speed runs required for competition. Each adjustment was tested on short flights over the Solent, with pilots providing immediate feedback. Among those test pilots was Flight Lieutenant John Boothman, who would go on to secure the decisive victory in the Schneider Trophy race. The testing period also revealed the limits of endurance. The S.6B was not designed for prolonged flight or heavy maneuvering. Its fuel capacity allowed for little more than the competition runs themselves, and pilots had to maintain extraordinary concentration to avoid overheating or engine failure. This narrow operational window was acceptable in the context of the Schneider races, but it underscored the fact that these were purpose-built machines, engineered solely for maximum speed over a fixed course. Despite the risks, the S.6B proved itself stable enough in the hands of skilled pilots and strong enough to withstand the extreme forces generated by its power plant. By September 1931, the aircraft was declared ready for competition. The test phase had been a compressed, high-stakes process, but it confirmed that the S.6B was capable of exceeding both its predecessor's performance and the speeds of its international rivals. The transition from prototype to race-ready aircraft was completed in record time. What had begun as a refinement exercise had resulted in a machine that was not only competitive but capable of setting new world records. The testing era of the S.6B thus bridged the gap between the workshop and the racecourse, proving that Britain's continued participation in the Schneider Trophy had been justified, and that Mitchell's design philosophy was pointing the way toward the future of high-performance fighter aircraft. The Supermarine S.6B entered service in 1931 under the auspices of the Royal Air Force High-Speed Flight, a specialized unit formed to prepare Britain's entries for the Schneider Trophy. This was not service in the conventional military sense, as the aircraft was never intended for combat. Instead, it represented the operational phase of a project where the RAF, Supermarine, and Rolls-Royce collaborated to achieve a victory that carried both technical and national significance. The high-speed flight was stationed at Calshot, where pilots and ground crews worked under conditions more akin to military training than sport. The first operational deployment of the S.6B was to the 1931 Schneider Trophy race at Calshot. On 13 September, Flight Lieutenant John Boothman flew one of the S.6B aircraft to victory, completing the 7-lap, 350-kilometer course at an average speed of 340.8 miles per hour. This achievement secured Britain's third consecutive win in the series, allowing the country to retain the trophy permanently. The performance of the aircraft was flawless. The Rolls-Royce R engine ran without failure, the aerodynamic refinements worked as intended, and the handling was stable enough to allow Boothman to concentrate on precision flying. The S.6B had fulfilled its mission perfectly, and in doing so, it brought Britain international acclaim. But the operational phase did not end with the trophy itself. Having secured the prize, the high-speed flight continued to push the aircraft further in timed record attempts. On 29 September 1931, Flight Lieutenant George Stainforth flew the S.6B to a new absolute world speed record of 407.5 miles per hour, the first time an aircraft had ever exceeded 400 mph. This record was more than a symbolic milestone. It demonstrated that aerodynamic principles and power plants developed for racing were capable of breaking into a new era of high-speed flight. The reactions to these achievements were significant. Pilots praised the S.6B as a machine that, though demanding, handled predictably at racing speeds. Ground crews admired the engineering solutions that kept the powerful R engine running under extreme strain. Military leaders, including those skeptical of spending resources on racing, acknowledged the value of the program as both a technical experiment and a propaganda tool. The victories enhanced Britain's prestige at a time when aviation was seen as a measure of national power. In this sense, the entry of the S.6B into operational use was more than a race deployment. It was a demonstration of what concentrated engineering effort could achieve. The RAF high-speed flight treated the project with the seriousness of a combat mission, and their success validated the collaboration between the Air Ministry, private industry, and individual patrons. Though the aircraft never flew patrols or combat sorties, its role in competition and record-setting carried strategic weight, showing the world that Britain led the field in high-performance aviation. Thus, The early operational role of the S.6B bridged the gap between sport and national defense. In winning the Schneider Trophy and setting new speed records, the aircraft proved itself not only as a racing machine but as a symbol of technical mastery, laying the groundwork for the transition from competition aircraft to frontline fighter concepts. The Supermarine S.6B never saw combat in the literal sense. It was a purebred racing machine with no provisions for armament, protection, or operational endurance. Yet, its role in the evolution of combat aviation is undeniable, because the lessons it embodied directly informed the aircraft that would dominate aerial warfare less than a decade later. In that way, the combat adaptation of the S.6B existed not in its own airframe, but in the translation of its design principles into frontline fighters. The first area of influence was aerodynamics. The S.6B's sleek fuselage, thin, low-drag wings, and fully faired struts were conceived for speed records, but the same concepts were invaluable for combat aircraft that needed to outpace and outmaneuver their opponents. R.J. Mitchell and his team carried forward the aerodynamic refinements from the S6 series into designs such as the Type 224 and ultimately the Spitfire. Features like flush riveting, smooth fuselage contours, and refined radiator placement had their origins in the S.6B. The combat aircraft of the late 1930s, including those that fought in the Battle of Britain, drew directly on these innovations. The second area was power plant integration. The Rolls-Royce R engine was experimental and built in limited numbers, but it was the ancestor of the Merlin, which would become one of the most important combat engines of the Second World War. The cooling methods tested on the S6B, with radiators integrated into floats and surfaces to minimize drag while coping with immense heat loads, provided vital data. These experiences guided Rolls-Royce engineers as they refined high-output engines suitable for both racing and sustained combat use. In this sense, the S6B was a laboratory for technologies that later gave fighters like the Spitfire and Hurricane the edge in battle. Tactically, the aircraft's record-setting speed had a psychological and doctrinal impact. Military planners saw that speeds over 400 miles per hour were achievable, breaking assumptions that aircraft performance had plateaued. This realization influenced doctrines on interception, pursuit, and air superiority. If a racing seaplane could reach such speeds, then combat aircraft would soon require similar capabilities. Thus, while the S6B itself carried no weapons, it reshaped the goals and expectations of military aviation in Britain and abroad. There was also a subtle form of strategic adaptation. The Schneider Trophy victories and the subsequent speed record demonstrated British dominance in high-performance aviation, a fact not lost on rival nations. Italy and Germany, both of whom had fielded advanced racing seaplanes, took careful note. The knowledge gained by Britain through the S6B gave its engineers a head start, one that became evident when the Spitfire entered service just in time to meet the Luftwaffe in 1940. In summary, the S6B never fired a shot in anger, but its contribution to combat aviation was real and measurable. It turned the theoretical into the practical, showing that extreme speed, efficient aerodynamics, and powerful engines could be harnessed together. The aircraft's combat use was therefore indirect. It served as the bridge between sport and war, a racing plane whose DNA carried forward into one of the most decisive fighters of the 20th century. Although the Supermarine S.6B existed in only 2 examples and was never intended for series production, its design lineage and engineering solutions inspired a chain of technological evolution that extended far beyond the Schneider Trophy. In essence, the aircraft represented a concentrated package of innovations that would reappear in subsequent prototypes, experimental models, and ultimately in combat machines that carried Britain through the Second World War. The most direct evolutionary line can be seen in the continuation of Supermarine's design philosophy. After the success of the S6B, R.J. Mitchell and his team applied many of the lessons learned to their next projects, including the Supermarine Type 224 and Type 300, the latter evolving into the Spitfire. Features such as streamlined fuselages, efficient wing shapes, and refined radiator systems were not merely copied, but further optimized for combat requirements. The S6B, therefore, acted as a technological testbed, proving concepts that would be indispensable in later designs. Engine development also followed this path of evolution. The Rolls-Royce R engine, which powered the S6B to victory and record-breaking speeds, was a specialized racing power plant with limited application in day-to-day service. However, the knowledge acquired from running an engine at such extreme power settings guided Rolls-Royce engineers in creating the Merlin. The Merlin would later power a vast array of aircraft, including the Spitfire, Hurricane, Mosquito, and Lancaster. Without the lessons learned from the stresses placed on the R engine, the Merlin's reliability and performance might never have reached the same level. There were also small but meaningful experimental adaptations. Some aspects of the S.6B's cooling system and structural layout were studied further in specialized test aircraft. Engineers experimented with alternative radiator designs, propeller configurations, and surface finishes, refining drag reduction methods that became standard practice in the late 1930s. The limited production of racing aircraft like the S.6B meant they were effectively prototypes of future technologies, compressed into highly specialized machines. The influence of the S.6B was not confined to Britain. International observers studied its performance closely. Aviation journals and technical reports circulated among European and American engineers, and while foreign designers often pursued their own paths, the demonstration of speeds exceeding 400 mph altered expectations globally. Aircraft manufacturers in Germany, Italy, and the United States recognized that airframes and engines could be pushed far beyond what had seemed practical only a few years earlier. The S.6B thus indirectly contributed to a worldwide acceleration of military aviation development. As for physical variants, the S.6B had no direct successors beyond its two built examples. However, it stood as the final stage in the Supermarine racing seaplane series, following the S4, S5, and S6. Each step represented incremental refinement, and the S.6B was the culmination. Its design, though frozen in the form of a racing seaplane, was effectively a prototype in the broader Supermarine lineage that led directly to one of the most iconic fighters in history. In technological terms, the S.6B represented a bridge. On one side stood the age of interwar racing, with nations vying for prestige in competitions like the Schneider Trophy. On the other side was the era of advanced combat aircraft, where those same design principles would decide the outcome of wars. Variants and derivatives were not built in the conventional sense, but the spirit and substance of the S.6B lived on in multiple forms, refined, adapted, and deployed in ways that far exceeded the scope of its original mission. The global impact and legacy of the Supermarine S.6B extended well beyond its brief operational career as a racing seaplane. Its triumph in the 1931 Schneider Trophy race, coupled with the subsequent world speed record, established Britain as a leader in high-speed aeronautical engineering, at a time when international prestige and strategic advantage were closely linked to aviation progress. The symbolic victory helped maintain British morale during a period of economic uncertainty and reinforced the government's decision to support advanced aeronautical research. The S.6B's influence can be measured most clearly in its role as a direct precursor to the Supermarine Spitfire. The technical experience gained by Mitchell and his team laid the groundwork for an aircraft that would become central to Britain's defense in the Second World War. Aerodynamic streamlining, structural design principles, and Rolls-Royce's engine expertise converged in the Spitfire, giving it the performance edge that proved decisive during the Battle of Britain. Without the S.6B and its predecessors, the path to such a fighter would likely have been far longer and more uncertain. Internationally, the aircraft inspired both admiration and competition. Reports on the S.6B circulated widely, and nations such as Germany, Italy, and the United States noted its performance as a benchmark. In particular, Germany's development of advanced fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 drew upon similar aerodynamic concepts and the pursuit of high-speed flight, while Italian seaplanes had long been rivals in Schneider competition. The S.6B's world record in 1931 effectively closed that chapter, shifting the focus from air racing to military readiness. The aircraft's cultural legacy is equally significant. It came to symbolize not only technological achievement, but also national resilience and forward-looking vision. In the decades following its retirement, the S.6B was celebrated as the machine that bridged the glamorous age of air racing and the practical demands of war. Surviving examples have been preserved in museums, most notably at the Science Museum in London and the Solent Sky Museum in Southampton, where they serve as reminders of the machine's role in shaping modern aviation. The S.6B also marked a turning point in the perception of aviation competitions. After its victory and the establishment of new records, the Schneider Trophy races ceased to be the dominant stage for international rivalry. Instead, the lessons learned from them transitioned into national military programs. The competition's end coincided with a shift in priorities from peacetime prestige to preparation for the looming conflicts of the 1930s and 1940s. In a broader sense, the S.6B's legacy lies in its demonstration of how specialized research projects, even those seemingly detached from military needs, can have profound consequences for national defense. A racing seaplane, built for a single contest, indirectly contributed to the survival of a nation during one of the most critical moments in its history. This dual legacy of sport and strategy ensures that the Supermarine S.6B is remembered not merely as a footnote in aviation history, but as a pivotal stepping stone in the evolution of modern air power. Beyond its celebrated victories and obvious link to the Spitfire, the Supermarine S.6B also has an unseen chapter in aviation history. Much of its influence was embedded in the technical lessons it left behind rather than in any extended operational life. The aircraft was never mass-produced, nor was it adapted directly into a combat platform, but it served as a laboratory in the air. Test pilots and engineers collected invaluable data on engine cooling, propeller efficiency, and structural tolerances at speeds far beyond anything encountered in service aircraft of the early 1930s. These findings circulated quietly among design bureaus and research institutions, providing a foundation for advancements that were not immediately visible to the public. The R-engine program in particular created pathways for secretive research. Rolls-Royce engineers working to refine metallurgy, fuel chemistry, and lubrication systems set precedents that would later be used in wartime development of high-performance engines. Much of this work remained classified at the time, as governments were increasingly aware of the strategic importance of pushing aircraft performance boundaries. In effect, the S.6B became a bridge between open international competition and closed military-industrial development, its data carried forward into programs shielded from public view. There were also unrealized proposals to adapt elements of the S.6B for alternative purposes. Some discussions in the early 1930s explored whether streamlined hull forms or wing structures tested on the racer could be scaled into long-range reconnaissance seaplanes. Although no direct conversions were attempted, the theoretical groundwork influenced projects like the Supermarine Type 224 and later the Walrus and Stranraer flying boats. These aircraft carried echoes of the design philosophy pioneered on the racing seaplanes, even if their appearance and function diverged dramatically. Another little-known aspect is the way the S.6B served as a benchmark for international aeronautical research. Institutions such as the Royal Aircraft Establishment and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in the United States used its performance records as case studies in airflow behavior, particularly around radiator ducts and high-speed wing loading. These investigations went beyond prestige racing and helped advance aerodynamic theory at a global level. In the personal accounts of pilots and engineers, the S.6B also occupies a distinct space. Though not widely published, technical memoirs and post-war reflections emphasized the razor-thin margins between success and disaster when flying the aircraft. Its unforgiving handling and extreme engine output meant that each flight risked mechanical failure or pilot error. Yet those very challenges forced improvements in training, instrumentation, and safety margins for subsequent prototypes. Even in its hidden risks, the S.6B shaped the cautionary lessons that accompanied the pursuit of speed. Today, the unseen legacy of the Supermarine S.6B rests not only in the museums that preserve its sleek form, but also in the countless technical documents, design sketches, and recollections that never made headlines. It represents the idea that breakthroughs often occur in places not immediately tied to their ultimate impact. A racing seaplane, flown for minutes at a time in competition, contributed silently to the decades of aerial dominance that followed. In these quieter chapters lies the full measure of its influence, not only as a national trophy winner, but as a hidden catalyst for the transformation of aviation. The story of the Supermarine S.6B concludes with its place in the broader narrative of aviation's transition from sport to survival. In 1931, when the aircraft set its world record, few could have imagined that the same principles driving a racing seaplane would, less than a decade later, form the backbone of Britain's air defense. Its achievement was not just in the speed it attained, but in the way it transformed the relationship between experimental design and practical application. The S.6B proved that risk-laden competitions could generate knowledge of lasting value, knowledge that could be mobilized in the face of global conflict. Its symbolic resonance also endures. The S.6B stands as a reminder of how prestige-driven projects can outgrow their original purpose. Built to secure Britain's reputation in the Schneider Trophy, it ended up as an essential precursor to one of the most iconic combat aircraft ever produced. Its streamlined fuselage, efficient radiators, and engine management systems are embedded not only in the Spitfire, but in the wider philosophy of designing aircraft capable of balancing speed, power, and endurance. It demonstrated that success at the edge of possibility could redefine the limits for an entire generation of engineers. In cultural memory, the S.6B represents more than a machine. It embodies the spirit of engineering daring, the willingness to invest in solutions before their relevance becomes obvious. At the time, some critics questioned the expenditure on such an esoteric pursuit, yet in hindsight, the benefits were incalculable. The aircraft helped secure Britain's aeronautical leadership at a decisive moment and inspired young designers who would carry aviation into the jet age. Its influence can be traced not only through Mitchell's Spitfire, but also in the later design ethos that valued aerodynamics and engine synergy above all. The preservation of the surviving examples ensures that the S.6B remains part of public consciousness. Visitors encountering its sleek, minimalist form in museums may not fully appreciate the dangers it posed to its pilots, or the experimental fragility hidden beneath its polished exterior. Yet they see in it a milestone, a tangible link to the period when speed was both a sporting goal and a strategic imperative. Its survival as a physical artifact anchors its story in the broader arc of technological history. Ultimately, the legacy of the Supermarine S.6B is found in its dual identity, a racing aircraft designed for glory and a foundation stone for wartime aviation supremacy. It lived briefly, flew rarely, and yet left a mark that shaped decades of design and doctrine. Its role in aviation history demonstrates how machines of limited immediate purpose can leave behind legacies that extend across generations, redefining not only what aircraft could achieve, but also how nations prepared for the challenges of an uncertain future. The final assessment of the Supermarine S.6B rests not on the hours it logged in the air, nor on the number of units produced, but on the profound consequences of its existence. It stands as one of the clearest demonstrations in aviation history of how a highly specialized, short-lived aircraft could shape the future of military and civil flight. In less than 2 years of activity, it redefined what was possible in terms of speed, aerodynamics, and engine performance, leaving behind a legacy that far outweighed its limited physical presence. Its achievement in 1931 symbolized more than just Britain's technical victory. It marked a transition in global aviation culture away from wood and fabric improvisation toward sleek, scientifically engineered machines that embraced all-metal construction, precise aerodynamics, and powerful, purpose-built engines. The S.6B was not alone in this transition, but its success accelerated the trend and gave Britain an undeniable edge in the years leading up to the Second World War. The lessons learned from its creation, its performance, and its risks were absorbed by a generation of designers, pilots, and policymakers. The aircraft's influence radiated outward in unexpected ways. Rolls-Royce leveraged its experience with the R engine into the creation of the Merlin, one of the most successful power plants in aviation history. R.J. Mitchell's team took the aerodynamic principles proven on the Racer and refined them into the Spitfire, a fighter that became synonymous with Britain's resilience and tactical brilliance. Other nations studied the S.6B as a benchmark, whether openly through published reports or quietly through intelligence and observation, acknowledging its role in setting new global standards for performance. Equally important is the cultural and symbolic dimension of its legacy. For Britain, the S.6B became a symbol of ingenuity at a time of political and economic strain. It demonstrated that bold engineering could deliver results of national significance and reinforced the notion that investment in aviation research was not just a matter of prestige, but of survival. Its victories resonated with the public and with decision-makers, creating momentum that sustained critical programs into the late 1930s. Today, the surviving S.6B stands preserved as a museum artifact, its polished metal skin still gleaming under exhibition lights. Visitors see in it not only a relic of a bygone sporting competition, but a technological ancestor of one of the most famous fighters of all time. It is celebrated in scholarly works, aviation histories, and cultural memory as the machine that bridged two worlds, the flamboyant age of speed contests and the grim necessities of global war. In closing, the Supermarine S.6B represents an extraordinary paradox, a racing seaplane that never saw combat, produced in only 2 examples and flown for limited events, yet responsible for reshaping the trajectory of modern aviation. Its impact demonstrates that influence is not measured by scale or longevity, but by the depth of its technological and strategic consequences. The S.6B did not just win a race, it helped secure the foundations of victory in a war yet to come.